Hi, everyone. It's Mindrolling, and I am back, and I am with Sally Quinn. And I'm really happy to have you here, Sally. And so, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you.
Sally wrote. Well, let's start with. I know of Sally, although well before she wrote this book, and she's a longtime Washington Post journalist and columnist, and was a television commentator, and right in the thick of it all in Washington through many, many, many years, and was married to Ben Bradlee, who, any of you who don't know who Sally is now, there's a movie out called The Post, and it is primarily featuring Ben Bradlee and what went on with the Pentagon Papers and the Washington Post with Katharine Graham. And I just watched that, Sally, by the way. And I guess the gal who played Ben's wife was his previous wife in that
Right. That's
incarnation,
right.
right?
And Tom Hanks played Ben, and Meryl Streep played Kay, Katharine Graham.
Yeah. An incredible job both of them did.
Well, also, there was a documentary about Ben that came out this fall from HBO that was called The Newspaper Man, which was very, very well done.
Oh,
That was a
God. I'm sorry I
beautiful
didn't see
film.
that. Oh, great. Well,
Well, you
that's
should
some.
watch it because
Yeah.
it's fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. Will do. Will do. So Sally's had quite a life. I live in the South now, but I'm Canadian. I'm from Montreal, although I've spent a large part of my life here in the States. I'm a citizen now, a dual, and Sally. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, which
Oh,
is the first time I've been anywhere near the South. Moved here because my wife to be moved here, and I followed her here. I was out in L.A. I had a record company out there, and Sally is from the South, and that is the beginning of. Let's really hear a little bit about your upbringing, because from where you started to where you ended up, in many ways, is quite a journey. And I think it would be great for people to just get a little idea of your upbringing and where and the when.
well, my mother was from Savannah, Georgia, and I was born in Savannah, Georgia. And my father was off in World War II at the time, and then later ended up in Korea. And and so we spent time in Statesboro, Georgia, which is where my mother's family was from, in the summers, and while my father was away at war, living in Savannah and Statesboro, Georgia, which is about a tiny little town outside of Savannah. And we lived that my ancestors were McDougalls. They were all Scots who had come down from North Carolina
Uh,
with the turpentine trade, and they had built this huge plantation house, beautiful white columns, the old traditional Southern mansion. And so we spent all this time there, and my aunt Ruth played the organ in the local church, Presbyterian church, but she also had another whole religious or faith or spiritual life, which was the she was part of that the whole Scottish Stones, believing in the Stones, and and time travel, and the occult, and uh,
oh, really?
palmistry and tarot cards and astrology and psychic phenomenon and voodoo, and so I was brought up with that. I mean, I'd go to Sunday school, but this was my what I call my embedded religion, because that's what I was brought up with, and that's what I believed all of my life. And then you get to a point in your life where, for instance, if you're a Catholic and you're brought up to believe that if you sin, you're going to burn in hell for eternity, and then you grow up and you think, oh, I don't really believe this. However, if you do something really bad, there's this little thing in the back of your brain that says, "Oh my God, am I going to burn in hell forever?" So, even though intellectually this didn't make any sense, it worked for me And I believed it. And a lot of these things I still do. I mean, I still follow astrology and I read tarot cards and palms, and I am psychic. And my mother was, my aunt was, my grandmother, my sister. We all have some
Mm.
psychic abilities. And so the ghosts, we had, the house was haunted, of course. Right? What Southern mansion is not haunted? And so that was my religious upbringing, and it sort of followed me through my life in various ways, and superstitions, and I did start this website for the Washington Post, a religion website, but once I sort of got to be I became an atheist very early on in my life, because my father was in World War II and he liberated Dachau, and he had photographs taken of all of the emaciated bodies and piles of dead bodies, and he had a scrapbook made, and excuse me, and he hid them, and I found them, and I asked him what had happened, and he said, this is explained what the Nazis did. And I said, Daddy, did God know about this? And he said, yes, he did. And I said, well, how is it possible that he could let this happen? And he said, well, God works in mysterious ways. And I cried myself to sleep that night. And all I could think about were these little Jewish children in the concentration camps, and their parents praying for their survival. And they're praying to the same God I'm praying to every night to bless my mother and my father and my sister and my brother. And look what happened to them. And so it became clear to me that there was no such thing as God. And that's when I stopped believing in God, when I was 4. Although I didn't learn the word atheist until I was 13. And all that time I thought, that I was the only person in the world who didn't believe in God. And I was just really embarrassed and ashamed and horrified and scared and everything else. It was such an incredible liberation to find that there were people who were atheists who didn't believe in God. And so for the rest of my life, I was an atheist until I started this religion website for the Post 11 years ago. And I backed into it because I didn't start it because I was religious. I started because as a journalist, I felt that we weren't covering religion, and religion has played a huge role in American politics and foreign policy. And
Mm.
so it was really based on that when I first started it. And but then I began to study religion. One of my close friends, John Meacham, is a religion scholar and a historian. And he had said to me, "You're not an atheist." And I said, "Oh, yes, I am." And he said, "Oh, no, you're not."
Yeah, I love that part
And
in the book. Yeah.
and he said, "Well, why you don't know anything about religion." And so he said, "Why don't you study religion?" And he gave me a list of books to read. And he said, then if you decide after that that you don't believe, then fine. But at least you will have learned something and read something and been thought about it. And that started me on a study of religion, and not just one faith, but all faiths. And I just became consumed with it. I was just obsessed with the whole idea, and I still find it the most fascinating subject there is, because I think that 95% of the people on this planet, their lives are informed or led in some way by some belief in a faith. And I kept thinking to myself, there are all these smart people out there who actually do believe in God. So, and millions and billions of people on the earth. And so there must be something there. I've got to figure out what it is. And so, I went in, I did do this study of religion, and I came away toward the end, and I had to finish the book. It came out in September, and I was on deadline, and I was about 2 months before I had to finish the book. I thought, oh my God, I have got to figure out the meaning of life. and,
Too much.
I've only got 2 months to do it. But I really thought about it for, of course, years. But in the end, I realized that I don't call myself an atheist anymore, because I think that's a negative word, and I'm not a negative person. And besides, I don't think anybody knows. The word agnostic doesn't mean anything to me, because it just means you don't know, and nobody knows. My favorite bumper sticker is "I don't know and you don't either." And but I found many things about many religions that I really loved, and that I sort of adopted. in my own sort of faith practice and beliefs and views and perceptions. And so, I mean, I guess you could say I sort of cherry picked from a lot of religions. And then I sort of made up my own religion and my own sense of spirituality. And so, if somebody asks you what you are, ask me what I am, I simply say I have a religion of my own. And I think most of us do. Because I think if you walk into a national cathedral with 3,000 people or a synagogue or a mosque with that many people, every single person there does not believe exactly the same thing. I mean, if they have a relationship with God or with Jesus, or it's got to be personal. And so everyone's beliefs are
Mm.
personal. No one believes exactly the same thing.
Yeah. I went to India. I'm Jewish. I was completely, utterly disenchanted with religion and disenchanted with the whole process that I had to go through. My father dragging me to the synagogue and the whole 9 yards. And it wasn't, so I was a pretty unhappy young man, teenager. And it wasn't until psychedelics came along in the mid 60s that I started, and I did psychedelics, and then had an understanding there was something that connected us all. There was something that connected me to a deeper place. All of the usual stuff using psychedelics, and when I went to India with Ramdas, I he went back the second time because he had came back and said I met this incredible being, and so few of us. He said I can't tell you who he is or where he is, but a few of us twisted his arm and went over to India and did meet him. And so, what does he start talking about? Two major things, and it's just what you're saying here. And one was he'd point his finger at like this, and he'd go in Hindi, sub ek, all one. It's all one. Christ, Krishna, Buddha, Muhammad,
Yeah.
all one. So he immediately instilled that in us. And then all he did for those first weeks or whatever, or actually for a long time, was talk about Christ. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, Christ. I don't even have any idea. I was taught in school that Christ wasn't good, actually. From people who had actually been in the camps and so on, that were my teachers, that were really negative and, very wounded, obviously, people. So we were completely turned around back to where we came from, going to India, if you could imagine such a thing. But it completely became whatever served us was what we used to go further inside of ourselves, and it was whenever the word religion comes up to me, I can't relate to the word God, never mind religion. As a it's such a it's a charged thing, and what does it really mean for any one person? Buddha mind, I might like that a little bit better, how the Buddhists describe it. But just
Well,
the
I think, yeah, I think, in when the title of my book is Finding Magic.
yeah,
And magic is, I use the word magic for God,
yeah,
um, because we're all looking for meaning in our lives. We're looking for the transcendent. We're looking for some sense of the divine, and we're looking for magic. And you can call it anything you want. And God means, I've interviewed so many people, and not one person has ever had the same definition of
if
God.
I God, yeah,
But the other thing is that I call myself a Christian with a small c, because I do believe that Christ was an extraordinary man. And I mean, the Islam, they recognize Christ as one of the great prophets. Most religions do recognize Christ as being an extraordinary prophet, if not necessarily the Son of God, as Christians. And in fact, a lot of Christians don't really believe that Jesus was the Son of God, but
yeah,
but his teachings are something worthy to be followed. And so I'd like to be considered. When you say, well, that's not very Christian of somebody, you don't necessarily mean that that person doesn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. You just mean that their behavior, that
yeah,
their goodness, their kindness, their values and ethics and morals.
yeah. But there's the thread of this, in terms of you have a great interpretation, a definition rather, of God in this book. It's not a direct one, but it's to me it's the theme of your book on two levels. And one and well, let me just read this little part for people who are listening. And you were talking about. Are you still with me, Sally?
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay. Because your
Yeah, I just no,
video
I
went away.
just yeah, I just realized it was low battery mode.
Oh, are
It's
you plugging in?
I just plugged in. Yeah, it
Okay, I've
should be
lost.
back.
Yeah, I've lost your video for some reason.
Oh gosh,
Hmm. Um. Do you see anything there that's
I don't.
no? Okay. Well, we're going to continue on. I don't want
All
to
right.
break this up. It's not the end of the world. Uh. Oh, there you are. Okay. You're
Okay.
back. I'm just making a note of the time because we'll do the edit. So yes, here's a passage from your book that to me is the grand definer of God, as far as I'm concerned. Sometimes when I feel I can't possibly fit any more love into my brain or my body, I'm filled up again. I'm never on empty. Never have been. In the end, it's the only thing that matters. I really think how you love is what defines you. What did I do? What have I done with all this love that keeps coming at me? I pass it around, give it away as fast as I can, because I know it will be replenished. That makes me happy. That knowledge gives meaning to my life. It took me a long time, too long, to learn love's lessons. I also figured out the big question: where does it come from? This never ending waterfall of love. It was still mysterious to me, but I was increasingly aware of a meaningful spiritual presence much greater than myself. There was a larger force guiding me, but I wasn't quite ready to call it God. That says it all as far as I mean, that's
Yeah,
my experience, that
yeah,
spiritual presence and love and the sharing of it. Ram Dass talks a lot about this these days. And there's a lot of questioning. Of course, we're in a very very tough period right now. What's going
yeah.
on in this country in this world?
I think somebody wrote the other day that we're in a state of collective trauma,
Yeah,
and I
very
think
much
that's
so.
true. Yeah,
So when people say, Ram Dass, what do you do, or what should we do? What can we do? Social action and so on, and change your heart, and then heart to heart to heart, we can change. And that's been his message, and it's what you're talking about right here. So yeah, I think this is the grand definition. Now, the other thing in the book that's so amazing to me is, of course, this love affair with your husband, Ben Bradlee, and the kind of devotion to each other that you had that's described in this book. Um, is something to aspire. I felt, okay, this is something to aspire to. I'm on third marriage, 10 years in, and working on it. Okay, we're still working on it. And the way that just talk a little bit about that, because that meeting with Ben and the subsequent a part of the book that really is focused on your relationship is pretty important.
well, I met Ben when I was asked to have a job interview with the editor of the editorial page, and he took me in to meet Ben. And I was 29 at the time, and he was 20 years older and married. And I was completely dazzled by him. I mean, I just thought that he was the most extraordinary man. First of all, he was incredibly good looking and very sexy and dynamic, and just he was just everything, swashbuckling and charismatic. And um, but he was like a god, if you'll pardon the expression. He was Mr. Bradlee, the editor of the Washington Post. And then, as it turned out, I didn't work at the Post then. And several years later, he called and asked if I would come in to be for an interview. And I went in, and he wanted me to cover parties for the Washington Post. I I was at that time the social secretary or had been the social secretary for the Algerian ambassador. I knew Washington's social life very well. And he said, "Have you ever written anything?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, nobody's perfect. You're hired." And at that time, we spent about a half an hour together, but the electricity between us was just extraordinary. I mean, the connection was just made. Both of us just looked at each other. I mean, I wasn't looking at him as a potential husband. I was just looking at him as somebody that I felt this connection to that I had never felt that way before. And I think, I mean, he later did talk about how we were both sort of blown away by each other. But it was 4 years until 4 years later that we got together, and that was, and we didn't actually get together. We went down to the convention together in Miami, and Nixon's second convention, and we flew down together on the plane. And by the time we got to Miami, I was madly in love with him, and he later admitted he was in love with me. Asked me to have dinner, but it never worked out because he had to be with other reporters, and we just never. And of course, it was right in the middle of Watergate, so that was very dicey. And they were all being, Woodward and Bernstein and Ben, their phones were being tapped and they were being followed, and there was just easily blackmailable. And I finally just said to a friend of mine, "I'm just so much in love with him, I can't stand it, and I'm going to have to tell him." And he said, "No, you can't, because if you do, he might take you up on it, probably will. And then, you could put everything in jeopardy, the story, the posts, the
Wow.
journalism, the country. You have to put your country first," he said, which was the only thing, as an army brat, he probably could have said that that convinced me. And so I took a job several months later as the first network anchor woman in America and New York, just to get away from Ben, because I just felt it was too impossible. And when I left, I asked him to take me for a farewell lunch, and I told him that I was leaving because I was in love with him. And I expected him to say, "There, dear girl, go to New York, be with your boyfriend, and live happily ever after." And he said, "I can't believe you're telling me this, because I'm in love with you." And we got
Wow.
together that night, and we were together for 43 years.
Wow.
And I mean, listen, we fought. I mean, we had fights just like other couples. But I think that, I mean, one of the things that I think that keeps marriages together is that we just had an enormous sexual attraction to each other, for one thing. I mean, we were just couldn't stay away from each other. And we were both dazzled by each other. I mean, we had such a good time, and we laughed and we had fun together, but we were both madly in love with each other. And I think that's the only way you can start a marriage, because things go bad sometimes, and there are ups and downs, and you've got to have that as a baseline. You've got to have that well of love to draw from. And I mean, one friend said he once saw Ben and me have an argument. He said it was like listening to Zeus and Hera having a fight. I mean, we went at each other, and Ben would sort of, because he's tough. Ben was tough, and so was I. And he'd say, "I wake up every morning with my dukes up." But we just didn't go to bed mad. It just didn't, and that's part of the secret too. I think it's not just loving somebody, but cherishing that person. And there was never a moment. I mean, I just, when he walked in the door at night, I would just feel, I would be thrilled. I mean, I would always run to him and throw my arms around him, and you could see he was so happy to see me. And I just think that, it takes work. I mean, I worked on it. I made sure that I did everything I could to make him happy and comfortable and feel loved and cherished. And it does work. But you have to pay attention. You have to listen to each other, and you have to respect each other.
Okay, you have to. New book, Sally Quinn. How to maintain and nourish a marriage. Okay, I think you have something to offer there, big time. So, oh boy. Well, there was a time in the book, and talking about that period of time, which I'm very familiar with. I was on in being in Canada, we were helping draft dodgers get over, escaping the war and so on. That's what I was doing in Montreal just at that time, mid 60s and so on. and you actually at some point, probably more around 70, I think, you went to Vietnam with
Yes,
your boyfriend at the time
yes, Warren Hogue. Yeah.
and got
Well,
into
he was working. Yeah, we got in a firefight.
yeah.
Well, Warren was at the New York Post, and he was slated to be the editor of the New York Post. And the owner, Dolly Schiff, didn't want him to go to Vietnam because she didn't want to lose him. And he had volunteered to go over there and cover the war. And I was, I'd had enough of war, seeing it with up close with my father, and in Korea, and being in a hospital with wounded soldiers for almost a year. And so I was not glamorized by war, but I really was curious to see Saigon. And so we went to Vietnam on our vacation and stayed with the Newsweek bureau chief, who was one of our closest friends. And we had a lot of good friends over there who were covering it. And one day we asked to go out into the countryside, and our host said, "You don't want to do that. That's crazy." But the Newsweek guide, the translator, said he would take us. And so we drove out for half a day and took a picnic lunch. And we didn't see, we saw rice paddies and people carrying things, mothers and children and all that. And then as we turned around to come back, we heard all this gunfire, and we realized that we were in the middle of a firefight. And the driver just screamed at us and said, "Get down on the floor." And of course, we both thought we were dead. And he just zigzagged, trying to avoid the fire until we got back to Saigon. But it was quite terrifying. And,
Mm.
I just have enormous respect for journalists who cover wars, and of course, enormous respect for those who fight
Yeah.
wars, as my father did.
Yeah. And in the book, though, you say instead what you came away with was a revulsion for the Washington Power Center, for those who had gotten us into what I concluded was this hateful war, and then were too cowardly to admit that they were wrong and got us in even deeper to protect their own reputations. They lied to the American people, and they lied in the most cynical way to those who were fighting. They seemed not to care and tried to make us all believe we were fighting for freedom and for the good of the country. It's not that I hadn't known this already. Somehow I hadn't wanted to admit it. The reality of it was too painful to accept. After all, I had met quite a few of the people who were responsible. I didn't view them, or at least all of them, as evil, but I was convinced that what they did was evil. That experience changed me as a reporter and as a person. As a reporter, it expanded my world, enhancing my perceptions and observations and adding to my questions. As a person, it focused my attention on the importance of morality in politics and in my life. How to live became much more of a factor in my thinking, more than it ever had before. So this was obviously a seminal experience in your life.
It was. Well, and then, I mean, living through Vietnam, and of course, my father in the beginning was in favor of the war because he was a general. And, the president says we're going to war, as your commander in chief has given you an order. But he and the other generals slowly changed their mind, because they felt that, for different reasons than I did, but they felt that if you're going to fight a war, you should be able to win it. And what they felt was just evil was that they were sending all these boys over there to die, knowing that we were losing the war. The generals knew we were losing the war, and that they were dying needlessly, when if they wanted to end the war, they would have gone, and bombed Hanoi. Now that's not what I would have done, but they came away with the same idea, that it was an evil war and it was unjustified, and all of these people were dying needlessly.
Yeah. And one of the core things that in the book, and so much anybody can relate to, especially if you were in your formative years back at that time in the 70s, was certainly, of course, what everybody, you can watch the Post and see the whole drama around the Pentagon Papers, and then later Watergate. I was sitting with Ramdas and a couple of other people in the middle of New York City, working on an LP project of talks and music, consciousness record set called Love, Serve, Remember, which is what in the end our foundation is called. It's what we got. That's the only instructions we got from Neem Karoli Baba. Love everyone, serve everyone, and remember God. Feed people. And so that's how we. So we were in the midst of doing this with the TV on, 24/7, watching Watergate, right?
Yeah.
And meanwhile, your husband to be at that point still, right? When did you
Oh
actually?
yeah, we didn't get married until several years after
After
Watergate.
that, yeah. But of
Well,
course, you,
we got together in the middle of Watergate, so we
yeah,
were living together then.
yeah, and we well knew who Ben was, and of course Bob and
Carl.
Woodward and Carl Bernstein,
Hmm.
and so reading the book is like a little bit of a acid flashback, may I say, back into that time, which was
Yeah.
such a crucial time. And now here we are now. What in the world would Ben think of this, of what is going on right now? What could he? And the Washington Post being right in the center of the Post and the Times as it is.
Well, a number of people have asked me that, as you can imagine,
Yeah, of course.
and I think first of all, Ben was not ideological, really. I mean, he was a Democrat. He voted as Democrat, but he was predominantly a journalist, and his view of what his role was is to protect the First Amendment and to get the story and to get it right. So I think that his feeling right now would be, I think he would be appalled at what's happening, but I think he would see it as a great story, which it is,
Mm-hmm.
on the one hand, and see it as a great story, and his view would be to get the story, get it first, but get it right. Get it right, get it right, get it right. And you've seen the few times that reporters have made errors, the Trump people have gone berserk and sort of said, you see, they're all fake news and they're
Yeah.
the lying media and enemies of the people. So you can't make mistakes. You can't give them that ammunition. So I think that, I think that, there's a huge wall, a 2-story high wall in the Washington Post next to the Ben Bradlee conference room. And it has a quote from Ben saying, the truth, no matter how bad, is never as dangerous as a lie. And he just couldn't stand the lying. The lying made him crazy. So I think, he would be incredibly proud of the Washington Post and the work that we are doing now, and the kind of reporting we're doing now. And I think he would have enjoyed the competition that we have with the New York Times, because I think both papers spur each other on. And I think that I haven't, this was not true during Watergate, but there is a sense of camaraderie and respect. When the Times breaks a big story, I mean, obviously the people at the Post wish we had gotten it first, but on the other hand, they're glad that somebody has broken the story. So
Yeah.
I think that Ben would have respected that happening, and it's almost like watching a tennis match at Wimbledon. The Post hits one, and then the Times hits one, and the
Yeah.
Post hits one.
Mm.
But I also think that on the other side of it is that he would say, this is a great story and let's get it. But I also think that he would be really, really upset and concerned about what's happening to our country, because the First Amendment was extremely important to him, but he was first and foremost a patriot and an American, and he fought in World War II. And I think that he would be just deeply, deeply concerned about what's happening right
Yeah. To say the least. There's a great quote in this. There's a lot of great quotes, Sally. I love these quotes. Chapter heading quotes that you'd put in here.
now. Oh, thank you.
Yeah. But this one in particular is from Viktor Frankl, from Man's Search for Meaning. Credible being he is. If there's a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. This a little bit addresses the whole thing, of course, what happened to the Jews in Second World War. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. So as much love is in your book as is in this book on multiple levels, which really gets transmitted, there's plenty of suffering. And maybe you can just talk a little bit about how that. I mean, we in this is a tough concept, but in India, Maharaji used to say, "Suffering brings me closer to God," and he kept repeating that, and it was a way to kind of imbue in us. Uh, Stop running from it. Stop pushing it away. Get Embrace it a little bit and make friends with it. I mean, he never said anything like that, but this is my own personal thing about,
Hmm.
because we all have this suffering. Talk about it in your own life, because certainly, especially with your child, that was really tough stuff. I went through something similar actually, so I could relate.
Well, I think the most important thing is that nobody gets a pass.
Yeah.
Nobody gets a pass. You know, we all suffer in some way in our lives. Now, this is the one area that really I find that I cannot accept about religion and religious faith, is the idea of suffering, which is called theodicy. Um, how can an all powerful, all loving, I mean, omnipotent, omniscient God allow there to be suffering on this earth? It's like my asking my father, how could God let this happen?
Hmm.
And of all the people I've interviewed over all the years, not one person has been able to give me a satisfactory answer. And I think that's because there is no answer. And it doesn't make any sense to me how on any level, and I've tried to look at it every way, doesn't make any sense. It is part of life, but I don't, because of that, I do not worship a God, because I couldn't worship a being, a creature, an it, or whatever it is. I couldn't worship something or someone who could allow the kind of suffering that exists on this earth. And, you know, I mean, I've had a very lucky life. You know, I remember when Ben wrote his book, and he called it, the title of it was A Good Life. And at that point, we were going through all these problems with my son Quinn, who was born with a hole in his heart and had severe learning disabilities, and was sick most of his early life until he was a late teenager. And he's 35 now, and still has medical problems. He wears a pacemaker. But I spent the first 16 years of my life in Children's Hospital, and he was near death a lot of the time. And I remember looking at Ben at one point, I was saying, how could you title your book A Good Life when we've had so much suffering around our child and seen our child suffer so much? And, you know, I mean, Ben was sort of, he was, as I said, 20 years older than I was and more philosophical. He said, because on the whole, I think I have had a really good life and a wonderful life. And when I pull myself back now, I look back and I say, I have had a really wonderful life and a good life. And I'm filled with gratitude every moment for Quinn, who is now thriving and engaged to a beautiful girl and happy and working. And he has a website for young adults with learning disabilities called friendsofquinn.com. And so that suffering was something that I, I didn't embrace it. But I dealt with it and tried to make the best of it and tried to be as strong as I could, because my job really was to support Quinn and to help him grow and thrive. And in a way, was it was because he did survive. What was harder, in a way, was watching Ben get dementia and watching him
Mm.
decline,
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
that went on for, I mean, he was diagnosed 8 years before he died. In the last 2 years, he really couldn't function. I mean, very well. And I slept in the bed with him every night until he died. I never had a nurse take care of him. But I
Mm.
mean, I had to bathe him, and I had to get in the shower with him and wash him. I had to teach him how to brush his teeth. He couldn't, I had to brush his teeth and get him dressed. And he was sundowning. He'd get up at 2 in the morning and say, I have to go to the White House to meet the president, that kind of thing. and it was exhausting, absolutely exhausting. And just to watch the person that you love the most just slowly disappear away from you, but not die, that was really incredibly painful, and that there was a lot of suffering there. But I also have to say that those last 2 years with Ben, which were the worst in some ways, were also the most spiritual experience. That was the most spiritual experience I ever had in my life, being with him and taking care of him, because he was finally this tough macho guy, who I had been madly in love with all these years, was suddenly allowed himself to be vulnerable in a way I had never seen him be vulnerable. And so he let me take care of him in a way he had
Mm,
not done before,
right.
and let me love him in the way that I needed to love him. And in fact, I think those last 2 years were the happiest years of our marriage in an odd
Really?
way.
Wow.
I was more in love with him the day he died than I ever had been. And
Mm,
I think he with me.
wow. That's all I got to say. Wow. Now, back to the suffering. You do say in your book, you quote, is it Robert Rohr, the priest?
Richard Rohr,
Richard,
yeah.
Richard Rohr,
Hmm.
yes. Yeah, who I've wanted to talk to myself.
Oh,
And he
he's
quote,
absolutely, he's brilliant. He's
yeah,
brilliant.
I know, I've read some of his stuff. But he quotes Carl Jung, and I think we both have an affection for Carl Jung, about his point that so much unnecessary suffering comes into the world because people will not accept quote unquote legitimate suffering that comes from being human. I love that.
Yeah,
Ironically, this refusal of the necessary pain of being human brings to the person 10 times more suffering in the long run. That's a great
yeah,
quote. Really
yeah,
great.
yeah.
Um,
No, he's good.
another, I want to talk a little bit about two core things also that part of your book, and we can start with a quote from Annie Lamott, who I love. Annie Lamott is the greatest. I've done podcasts with her, and she's just something else. Uh, I do not at all understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us. What a twist, a turn of words.
Yeah, she's very clever.
Yeah,
Very clever.
really,
Yeah.
really much. But yeah, grace, mystery of grace. So, I mean, again, I'm not a big fan of the word God, and certainly not as an omnipresent somebody who does stuff and then doesn't do stuff, which is why didn't you do that stuff? I mean, I'm just yeah, I have a hard time with that. I guess I'm a little bit more attuned to the Buddhist ideal there, although I come from a tradition of it's bhakti yoga, which is the yoga of devotion, and so on. But Maharaji was beyond any sect or any of that, and yeah, so it was a completely different thing. But grace is certainly a core has a core relationship to the mystery, and I really like. We have a friend named Roshi Joan Halifax. I don't know if you know Roshi.
No.
She's a Zen abbot in Santa Fe. She's a wonderful, wonderful spiritual teacher, and she talks about it a lot, about honoring the mystery, and not running from it. And so, grace in your own life, you've had a ton of it, and uh, I would have to suggest that that informs your relationship to the events in your life, including the suffering. No?
I think that's true. I mean, grace is a funny word, because I think people have everybody has a different definition of it, and it's kind of like one of the Supreme Court justices said, I can't define porn, but I know it when I see it,
Yeah,
and yeah.
you know that's true.
Well, I mean, I
Yeah,
can't define grace, but I know it when I see it. And
yeah,
Ben wrote a very small book about Jack Kennedy after he was assassinated, called "That Special Grace," and that there was this incredible graceful part about Jack Kennedy that that drew people to him. I think that Ben was a very graceful person. I think that um, there, there was grace in my taking care of Ben and my loving Ben and his loving me. Grace in the suffering of Quinn and yet watching him overcome so many of his disabilities, and I think we see it in people's kindnesses, and I think we see it in values and ethics and morals, people caring for one another. I have to say that I think that in the last year since the election, we have seen such a lack of grace in our lives that I think it's been really almost traumatic because one of the things that you could say grace is magic, and so if my book is called Finding Magic, it means that you're looking for grace as well as magic. I mean, grace can be God too. And so I spend every single day looking for magic or looking for the transcendent or looking for grace. And I find it every day. I find something every day. But I don't think you can find grace unless you're looking for it, because you have to be able to recognize it. You have to be able to see it. And my son and his fiance, she has a child by a 5-year-old daughter by her first marriage, and then they got a dog together, this adorable King Charles Spaniel part poodle named Teddy Roosevelt, because
yeah,
they're both fans. And one day I was in the kitchen and Sunday morning, and they live in the house next door to mine. And Chloe came running in and was running around the kitchen playing hide and seek and hiding from me. And Teddy Roosevelt was following her, and they ran around, and then they left and left the room. And I just felt this incredible feeling of grace, that there was just this wonderful feeling of joy and happiness, that this innocent child and this adorable little dog had come in and just sprinkled fairy dust all
mm,
over me
mm,
and then walked out of the room. So I mean, or the the incredible doctors at Children's Hospital who work and spend so much time taking care of people, or I mean, I never understand, because I don't have it in me, the kind of people who can go into the slums and live there and take care of the poor. And I have nothing but awe and respect for people like that. But those things are what grace is about.
yeah, for sure. Now you've met so many uh, incredible people over in your life's journey being in Washington, and there was so everybody, go out and get this book because there's quite a lot of anecdotes that would be fun for you to read. One of them for me was around Barry Goldwater. Okay, who
Yeah,
is this
yes.
Republican? For those of you who don't know, he was a Republican leader back in the early 70s, late 60s, 70s, I guess. And my whole take on him was, he's another Nixonish kind of bad guy, and
Hmm.
then I'm reading this book and you're going on about how heartful he is and how warm and gracious, and I was like, "Oh my god, here's a case of getting this completely wrong and believing whatever the hell I was believing out there." But yeah, who is Barry Goldwater? I mean, come on.
Well, he got such a bad rap. He was a very close friend of Jack Kennedy's. They adored each other, and when before Jack was assassinated, he was going to run for president again, and Barry was going to run against him. And their plan was that they were going to campaign on the same plane, and that they would get off the plane, and that Barry would make his speech and Jack would make his speech, and they'd get all the crowds, both supporters from everybody out there making the speech, and then they'd get back on the plane and take off for the next place.
Really?
Yes,
Oh my.
because I mean, Barry had, I mean, he was incredibly decent, kind, honest. He had enormous integrity. He was a wonderful, loving person. He was like a surrogate father to me and to my brother and sister, and he actually lived with my parents when his wife got sick and went back to Arizona. He lived with them in their apartment, went down to the country with them on the weekends, and I mean, I knew him really well. Ben got to be best friends with Barry, and they
Really?
loved each other. And I remember they were doing a twin gig out in Orange County, which is very conservative, and the place was packed. And it was a conversation with Ben Bradlee and Barry Goldwater. And Barry got up and he said, "I know you're all here thinking you're going to see a bloodletting, and you're going to be very disappointed."
Mm.
And they had this love in.
Mm.
No, I mean, he was just a wonderful, he got a very, very bad rap.
Really?
And, Barry, I mean, he said a couple of things that he was, what he was a libertarian. He was born when Arizona wasn't even a state. And he was a cowboy, he believed that everybody should, I mean, he was pro-choice for one thing, he was pro-gay. Um, I mean, he believed that people should live their own lives. And so, I mean, he was very anti-government in that way because, he'd grown up in Arizona, had been independent. But I mean, he was also very tolerant of any religious point of view,
Mm.
and respected people. He was an honorary uh, Native American, loved by the Native Americans. And I mean, he was just a great guy. I think if one of the things he had was that he was so accepting of people and so respectful of people that he didn't have he wasn't very discriminating about his friends. He was nice to everybody, and if people were nice to him, he liked them. And so I think oftentimes the choice of the people he had around him was not the best.
Mm-hmm.
That's what
Mm-hmm.
I would say, that he didn't choose the best people around him.
Mm.
And because he was a conservative, I think he drew a lot of people who had a different view of conservatism than he did.
Mm. Okay, thanks for straightening me out on Barry Goldwater, Sally. God. Oh boy. Oh, do you want to tell a fun story from the book?
Sure.
Uh, the dog shit story. You got to tell that story. I love that story.
Oh, you mean the Buddhists?
Yeah, yeah.
My
When you went to Tibet.
well, I took a trip after I after I started the website. I decided I got a flyer in the mail saying, a 3-week trip around the world to study the great faiths. And we were going to go to 13 places and study all the faiths. And I thought, was Don Graham asked me to start the website. And I said, Don, I don't know anything about religion. I don't know anything about the internet. He said the same thing Ben did. Well, nobody's perfect. But I got John Meacham, who was a religion scholar, to be my co-moderator, which saved me. But the thing was that I realized that I couldn't run this website if I didn't know anything about religion, and I'd done reading and all that. But so I took this trip, and we ended up at one place. We went to Tibet, and so we had and Tibet, of course, is not the Dalai Lama. It's part of China, and the Chinese have basically tried to eradicate the Tibetans. A lot of them escaped to India, and brought a lot of the Han Chinese and Lhasa, which is the capital, is like a Potemkin village. I mean, it's sort of a fake village that looks like an old Tibetan village, and it's just a total tourist trap. There is the monastery up at the top of the hill and all that. So it's great to see, but and it's completely, I mean, on every corner are Chinese soldiers, and everybody's spying on everybody, and nobody feels safe. And so we had a guide who was absolutely adorable, and I can't remember his Chinese name, but anyway, I spent a lot of time with the guys on those trips because I learned so much from them. So I was asking about his family, and he was very open, but he said, I can't tell you very much because we're not allowed to, talk to people. And so anyway, at one point I asked him about his name, and he said, well, in Chinese it means dog shit. And I said, what do you mean dog shit? He said, well, that's my name. It's dog shit. And I said, why would your parents name you dog shit? And he said, well, when I was born, um, they named me, now can't remember, but something like good luck.
Mm.
And I was sick from the day I was born, and I was sick for years and years. And the doctors couldn't do anything. They thought I was going to die. And finally, my parents realized that they had really tempted the gods by giving me this name of good luck or good fortune or whatever else. And he said, the only way that they were going to get the gods off my case was to change my name. And so he said, they changed my name to dog shit so the gods would not be tempted to, to hurt me. And he said, and I got better the next day, and I've never had a sick day in my life. And I said, well, don't your friends find it, I mean, isn't it a little embarrassing when you introduce yourself as dog shit? He said, no, everybody understands why.
That's so great. That's the greatest story. So everybody out there, if you need to change a name, you know what to do now. Oh, God. And it's such a wonderful book. Everybody, Finding Magic, a spiritual memoir by Sally Quinn. And just one more little quote, which is, again, to me, it's the essence of the book. It's the essence of everything I understand in my own life. I have faith in the power of love. That's the significance of the stories in this book. Ultimately, loving is the most important thing a person can do. Giving and receiving love is encapsulated in another of my favorite words, albeit a rarely used one. And I've never heard of this word, by the way. Redimancy?
Redimancy.
Redimancy, which means the act of loving in return. George Sand was right when she wrote, there is only one happiness in life, to love and be loved. So beautiful. Great, great, great book. Everybody, you can go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/mindrolling. You'll see the show notes and all of the links to be able to get the book. And we're going to put up that film also of Ben Bradlee, the doc that Sally talked about early in the podcast, because I want to see it as well.
Oh, so it's fantastic.
We'll find it and link it up. It's probably on Netflix, if not on YouTube.
Good. It's called The Newspaper Man.
And The Newspaper Man. Okay. Mm-hmm. And also On Faith, it continues, does it not?
It does continue. We're trying to revamp it and make it into an app for a phone.
Yeah,
so it's
that's
a little
perfect.
bit on, Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but check out On Faith, and also, is there a website or anything that people can?
No, I mean, I have I have a sort of a Facebook fan page, but I don't have a website.
That's all that's needed these days is Facebook fan pages.
Not that I look at it, but I'm told it's there.
Oh, okay. Great to hang with you here, Sally. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Great. Thank you.
And
for a wonderful interview.
I will look forward to the next book around how to do the marriage properly and be successful.
Coming soon.
Coming soon. This is Raghu Marcus and Mindrolling and Be Here Now Network, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.